Hi, my name is Nikki Sampar. I've been working in the cloud space for almost pushing a decade now. Most of that has been in the security space. So when Umair pops up the presentation, you'll see that prior to Stacklet, I worked at T. Rowe Price, where I was a principal security architect. And so I have kind of sort of worked my way through kind of sort of both sides of the equation. The security side of the equation, which is where I spent the majority of time, and now I'm working on the FinOps side of the equation. And so, what I'd like to do today is kind of show you some thoughts on like how we can bleed these two together and show hopefully that they're really not that different. So, Umair, slide, please. Thank you, by the way. All right.
Perfect.
So as you can see that I think I don't need to explain to anybody why FinOps and security is important, right? I think we're all here. We all understand that these are critical aspects of your business, right? You cannot run a business that is not fiscally responsible, and you cannot run a business. You have to manage your risk, right? So what's the problem? The problem is that FinOps and security typically are not coordinated, right? You've got different teams of people using different tools, different data sets. So as a result of that, the signals that come out of these organizations, again, which are both very important functions, right? The signals that come out are mixed. So for example, from a security team, right, you might get a vulnerability that says, IP 71.43. Blah, blah, blah has a security risk, right? Whereas from a financial team, you might get, hey, we see a 15% spike in cost over our most important project, right? Again, very, very important input, but they're wildly different, right? So what does that mean? That means the people that need to mitigate these need to almost speak two different languages, right? They need to understand or try to understand how the FinOps team came up with that increased cost spike. And they need to, based on the vulnerability that was reported by the security team, try to understand, who had that IP at the time that this report came about, and has that IP moved? So is it the same resource? Does it still exist? So the people that are asked to resolve this have to spend a lot of time translating the input from one side to the other side, combine that into their own tool set and their own understanding to actually implement a change. So just to emphasize, the translation of this very critical information is difficult, right? And if anyone who's worked in operations or development, I suspect you understand the pain that I'm referring to. Slide, please, Umair. So how do you get past this? So again, just to reemphasize, right? This is a hard problem, right? This is a multifaceted problem with multiple perspectives. So what you need to do is you need to try and get everyone to agree and to understand, what is important to the organization, right? So you need to come up with, consistent processes, consistent policies that all the teams can agree upon. You need to try, and we'll talk about this in a moment here, to coordinate your data set and your tool sets so that everyone is starting to speak the same language. And if you can do this, again, I don't want to trivialize how hard this is. This is very hard to do. But if you can do this, you're going to lower the communication burden. You're going to increase how much each one understands of what the other person is saying, right? And then overall, you're going to improve your culture, right? So collaboration is key. Collaboration is going to lower the friction, it's going to improve communication, and hopefully put you in a better place. All right, so slide please, Umair. Okay, so now let's talk about, now that we've talked about, okay, this is the problem and this is why it's a problem, let's talk about, okay, well, so how does one go about remediating this, right? So there are two main bullets on this slide here. The first bullet is really about process and understanding, right? So the first thing that teams need to do is to agree upon like what are the goals. And I know this sounds trivial, but it's not as trivial as one would think. And I'll give you an example for that. And then the other part of understanding the process and level setting on the process is making sure that the teams understand each other in the same way, right? So I'll give you an example of something that sounds pretty easy, but actually may turn out to be a bigger item. So for those of you that work in, critical systems, you have to worry about disaster recovery, right? And the most common way to do disaster recovery is to have a hot standby. So from a security and uptime perspective, that's an important goal. From a FinOps perspective, they say, hey, look, we have all this infrastructure that's basically doing nothing, right? So by the teams coming together and discussing their goals, discussing their needs, you can start to level set on what is important to the organization. So that's the process aspect. Now let's go to the data aspect. The key in all of this, and one of the keys in slowing down remediation is, like I said on the first slide, is a translation, right? So by everyone using the same tool set, by seeing the same information, what assets are there, how do we refer to the assets, by coming up with common policies, by using same dashboards, then the data that all three teams are seeing becomes more unified, right? So by collaborating both in terms of process and in terms of data, the goal here is to remove the gaps between the teams. And by removing the gaps, you're going to increase the trust, you're going to increase the communication, and ultimately, I believe it will increase the time to remediation. All right. Next slide, please. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about policies, right? So how do you actually effectuate these changes, right? So one of the most important things to do is to come up with a set of policies that can be understood by all teams. So that means this policy has to be readable, um, if possible, and you happen to have an AI chatbot that can help you, so much the better. You want to have it in one place, right? So again, everyone is looking at the same policies in the same way, and it's all common. There are no surprises, right? You want to have consistent workflows. So if there's a spike in cost, as an example, all the teams are informed that that happens, or if there's a vulnerability, the same thing. The idea here is you're trying to get the same information and the same workflow going to all the parties. Again, I don't want to trivialize this. This is a lot of hard work and a lot of communication and a lot of work. But if you can do it, then what you're going to start doing is you're going to decrease the cost of remediation. And obviously, just like any other process, just like any other control, wash, rinse, and repeat, right? So you want to periodically review what is going on, and you want to make sure that you improve it as time continues. The key thing in all of this, and one thing I want to emphasize, is the human readable policy aspect of it, right? The policy essentially becomes a contract, right? So once the finance team, as an example, writes a policy, the other counterparts can read it and understand it and ask questions, right? So, and what you will find, I suspect, is that things will become a lot clearer. So I'll give you kind of a little funny analogy, right? It's like if like one of my kids comes home and with a speeding ticket and said I was driving too fast. And I say, well, my concept of driving too fast is, 10 miles over the speed limit, right? But knowing my daughters, that is not her interpretation of going fast. Her interpretation of going fast is probably like 30 miles over the speed limit, in which case I tell her she has to pay for her own ticket. But again, the point being here is that that policy now becomes a contract, an unambiguous contract between all the players, between all the teams. All right. Next slide, please, Amir. All right. So, okay, so now let's make it real, right? What you have, and I know and I understand some people are more familiar with Cloud Custodian and some are familiar with, maybe not as familiar with Cloud Custodian. But here are some simple Cloud Custodian policies. The one on the left is a FinOps policy, which is to do with underutilized CPU. And the one on the right is a security policy to do with IAM users. The point of this slide is to highlight that because we have a common policy that is understood and understandable by all parties, this is where you want to be. You want to get to a point where the security people and the operational people and the FinOps people, the FinOps teams, all can read and write in the same language. So this is an example. Hopefully, to all of you, this is pretty clear as to what's going on. I mean, you may not, again, be super familiar with AWS or Cloud Custodian per se, but I think we can all agree that with a little bit of work and probably not too much time, you should be able to understand at least the gist of what this policy is. So again, the ultimate goal is to have zero ambiguity. We're all looking at the same policies in the same repo with the same understanding. All right, next slide, please. All right, so let's try and wrap this up, okay? To go back to the beginning, right? FinOps security are critical. It's a hard problem. It's a nuanced problem. I don't want to trivialize it, but there is a path forward. And what I want to try and get across today is that by collaborating on in a detailed policy fashion on your assets, on your metrics, using the same data sets, the same querying abilities, you can come up with consistency between all these players, between all these teams. And ultimately, you will increase your release timelines. And if you implement the preventative measures that are available via Cloud Custodian and Stacklet, you can actually remediate and prevent a lot of these cost overruns, a lot of the security holes before they get too far, or ideally before they're even deployed, depending upon which method you approach. So again, just to wrap it all up, by coming up with clear policies, clear approaches, clear metrics, I think you can align your FinOps requirements with your security requirements and make it easy or easier for the operational teams and developers to remediate. So that's what I have. Hopefully that was helpful.